Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this special seminar on trade and fair and sustainable trade, EDANA is the leading global association and voice of the non-woven and related industry. Sustainability and free and fair trade are at the heart of our mission and vision. Over the last 12 months, market and trade conditions have been heavily influenced by the political situation. And this is probably only the beginning of a new era for the global trade. The international context is shifting. What used to be a rule-based order founded on predictable norms and stable procedure is now armed, and we see the setup of a new playing field. With the war in Ukraine, the energy crisis, the returns of inflation and higher interest rates, the tensions around Taiwan, the trade war between the US and China, which started during the Trump presidency and not really stopped by the Biden administration, trade conditions are changing with the risk of protectionism return and over-limitation of trade. And we all know the negative impact this can have on our production costs. The non-woven supply chain is truly global. Upstream and downstream, no region is independent, and every restriction of trade is impacting our industry. Moreover, the fight against climate change is another fundamental challenge, and I'm convinced that the trade policy has a role to play. In that context of multiple crises and uncertainties, the sustainability priority, my initial question when we prepared this seminar was what trade can do to address the biggest test of our time. Is there any opportunity to harness trade to tackle the major challenge of our world? Multilateral institutions can, of course, play an important role to foster cooperation, and I look forward to understand how the World Trade Organization can help the industry and, in particular, our industry. I'm pleased to welcome Bernard Keuten. Bernard heads external relations at the World Trade Organization, where he oversees the organizations dealing with the private sector, the civil society, and other intergovernmental organizations. Bernard is a former trade negotiator and a highly seasoned speaker on trade and WTO matters. Earlier in this career, he worked for the Netherlands and the European Commission on a number of trade files. Bernard, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Jacques, for that introduction. That kind of raises expectation. I'm a seasoned speaker. I've dealt with a number of files. Let me first and foremost thank EDANA for inviting me. It's important, and I feel humbled to be here because we're actually people that deal with policy. We deal not with products. We deal not with services. And now at exhibition, I'm surrounded by people who actually either make, sell, or buy product. And that makes me feel humble because what we do is actually in the support of the private sector. Now, I don't need to introduce myself anymore, Jacques, you already did that. Let me say a word about when I was approached for the first time, and I asked a question to someone here already, and she gave me the similar response. When you came to me and said, like, we're having a big exhibition from the non-woven industry, and I'm sure you hear this from everybody, the question is like, what do you mean? What is the non-woven industry? And then you start learning about it, and you find out that actually everything that you hold, wear, use, comes from you. And it's actually amazing that the industry is probably amongst itself very well known, but outside, the general person on the street hasn't heard of it, but uses it all the time. So I'm very pleased to actually be here. I want to cover three things. I want to say a few words about the organization because I'm quite certain that you don't know that much about it. If you do, I will be impressed because we on our side always think we are in the center of the world, but people like myself, and you go out all the time, you find out that nobody knows about you, nobody knows what you do, which is a shame because the bottom line is that what we do because we're trying to help you in doing your business. So what I want to talk about a little bit about WTO in general, what we do during crisis, the crisis that we face, and Jacques already referred to a few, and what we can do to ensure that you can actually do your job under fair and transparent conditions. And finally, how sustainability comes into play into the trade discussion. Now, a few things on WTO, its basics and its specifics. It's an organization that dates back to 1995. That makes it a fairly young international organization. Most international organizations are 100 years or older. We're fairly young. We had a predecessor, but to become an international organization based here in Geneva, you have to go back to 95. And what it does, it simply does, it sets the rules on trade between its members, the nation members. And we have 164 member countries, if you want to say it like that. And what we have rules and binding obligations that actually try to make sure that nations can trade on the basis of predictability, stability, and transparency. I mean, all of these rules that we have, all of the commitments that countries make, members of the WTO make when they say a tariff is 5%, you know what you're up to. They're binding, but a result of negotiations. It's not like people come to WTO and say like, oh yeah, we're happy to do this, we'll bind it under your rules and disciplines. No, 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 they negotiate. Everything, every word that the WTO stands for, every agreement that we have is the result of extensive and often very long negotiations. And many people, including amongst the private sector, tell us like it takes too long at WTO. There's only one response to that. The rules, the disciplines, the commitments that our members made in the area of trade are binding and they're there forever. This is not a best endeavor. This is not an organization through which you actually commit to something but that you can later on say like, well, I'm not in a position to do so right now. That is, I have to honestly say, the theory. That's how it was set up back in the 90s. I mean, in practice, we have different situations. I'll come to that. You should also know that 70%, over 70% of international trade is governed by WTO rules. And that's quite a lot if you start thinking about it. That means that, it's bound by commitments made by governments under the WTO. Now, how does it help you? It helps you to ensure fair and open competition, because you know what you're up to. You know what your competitor is up to because they're facing the same rules. There is no differentiation and no discrimination. So there's transparency, predictability. And there you come in the binding nature, there is recourse to a legal system that the WTO has. It's like a court system. You can go there as a government, you often get your input from the private sector, and you can have a legal case, and you can have a ruling on the behavior of one of the members of the WTO. Now there are two, I won't want to go into detail, two major pillars that we base this whole work on. It's called national treatment, most favored nation treatment. That's very technical. It basically means that one cannot discriminate. You cannot give you 5% and you 6%. 5% is what the government has bound under the system that I represent. There's also a constant negotiating platform where you can adapt, amend, or actually create new rules. And that is a very important element in the discussion about the link between trade and sustainability. Because there are many territories and areas where there are no rules or where rules are not sufficient or complete. There's constant negotiations taking place. And what we do on our side, I represent the Secretariat of the WTO, we monitor, and they don't like that, the behavior of our members. So whenever they come up with a policy, a measure, a rule, then what we do is we can't tell them whether it's right or wrong. What we can do, publish it. We can actually point to it. This is, for example, what we've done during the financial crisis in 2008, when members started taking restrictive measures. We started publishing them. We got them from different sources. So what we then do is expose the behavior of our member governments. As I said, they don't like it, but we are mandated to do that. So that's something that we do, and we also do that in support, again, of the private sector. I already said that what we have as commitments, that they are binding, meaning legally enforceable, and all of our members are under the obligation to inform the organization and through the organization other members and the public at large about what they're doing. And there was just a question on a particular EU policy. There's a lot of talk about, CBAM, IRA these days. Members of the WTO are obliged to inform the platform, the system, and therefore the public at large what they're doing why they're doing it, what it actually means, and how it's going to be implemented. It's not as easy as it sounds because, of course, people can delay, but they are obliged. And what happens if they don't do it? Again, that's relevant in the current context. Other members, other governments will call them to order and say, like, hey, we hear that you're doing this. You need to actually put all the information that you have on the table and explain to us in our committees, etc., that we have, what it is, what it does, where it's relevant, what it can mean in the future, when it will be implemented. And that's happening right now on a large scale, on a number of measures that are being taken, including the one I just mentioned, CBAM and the IRA in the United States. Now, what can happen if it's implemented, the policy becomes effect, or it takes effect? If a member believes that its interest is hurt, they can go to our legal system. I mean, there's a process. It has to go through consultation. You can't just go to the judge, so to say, and claim. You have to discuss, you have to negotiate, say, like, what is it? But at the end, you can enforce a decision on a measure taken by another member of the WTO, and you can get a ruling, and that ruling may say, you have to change it. That's the reason this system was developed, this whole organization and its agreements were negotiated, that you have the possibility not just to create transparency and predictability, but also to call other members to order if you believe that you've been hurt or your interests are being undermined. Decisions at the WTO are taken by consensus. That means very simple that, well, there's no rooms here, but I always use the example, if we think it's too warm in here and one of you wants to open the room, if another person opposes, the room will not, or the door will not be opened. Consensus decision making. Each member of the WTO, no matter what its size is, has one vote. That's incredibly democratic, but it also means it takes incredibly long time to get to any kind of result or agreement. Imagine that you have to negotiate agreement, you all have one voice. That is, as I say, democratic, but very difficult. The organization is very much driven by governments. There is, and I'm speaking personally here, unfortunately no direct role for outsiders, such as the private sector, such as civil society, because our members believe that because they sign off on these agreements and their parliaments ratify these agreements, that they actually, cannot leave this to outsiders. There's a whole debate you can have about what that means in terms of having information. Why are you not allowed into meetings? Why can't the private sector or civil society sit in? So far, it's not possible. It's what we call member-driven. So in case there is an issue, in case you come across, a problem in your business and you're doing business, you have to go to your government and say, listen, there's something happening in the country I'm exporting to, and I think it's a violation of WTO rules, or could you at least look into it? And if so, your government can raise that at WTO. That's how these processes start. And this happens on a constant basis, because you can imagine that trade policy is not a fixed thing. It constantly develops and moves. And unfortunately, if you take this into reality right now, many commentators have been saying that trade policy these days has become a weapon. It's become a weapon to actually, either react to behavior of another member of another country, even if it's not related to trade, but you can use trade to either try to punish them or get something done. That's why people now speak about trade policy having become a weapon, where it used to be an economic tool, nothing more and nothing less. Now, in terms of crisis, well, we have had a few, and we're facing a few. I mean, you mentioned the geopolitical tensions already. The war in the Ukraine has had an incredible effect. I think almost an underestimated effect on the global economy, on the social situation, on strategic relations, and on worldwide positions. I think but that's my personal view, I think it's underestimated. But it had its effect on the economy, and therefore it probably had its effects on your businesses. The same goes for the pandemic. My understanding is this has been explained to me that some of you have also been able to do business because there has been a growing need for some of the products that are coming out of your industries, or let's see that they use the input from your industries. But overall, you can argue that the pandemic and its fallout has been detrimental for global relations and for the global economy. And what you see and saw, and that you saw in the trade tensions you just referred to, Jacques, between the United States and China, for example, that there is a tendency of countries to say, okay, I'm going to think about my own interest, which is understandable, I know I have agreements in WTO. I know I have, obligations internationally, but I'm going to put tariffs on my imports. I'm going to block certain products, or I'm no longer going to export products that other may need. That we saw during the pandemic, we saw to an extent as a result of the war in Ukraine. And overall, that has a detrimental effect. And, ask any international economic organization and see their forecasts, they're quite low. I mean, sometimes there's a little bit of hope. You saw a spike after the pandemic, growth was going up again, but we're now expecting, a downgrading again. And this is due to the effects of these different geopolitical behaviors, on trade flows and on the global economy. I don't have to tell you that energy price spikes, have probably hurt your industry, are still very volatile, they're unpredictable. You see them going up and down. It's in a way unfortunate, maybe fortunate, depends on how you look at it. It's something that we don't deal with. Energy products are basically, because of the producing countries, kept out of the reality of the work of WTO. It's not that the products are excluded, but in practice, and I don't have to explain why, there's like a parallel, world economy in the world of energy. Now, supply chain disruptions is something that probably hurts you on a daily basis. I think not just because of geopolitics, because of some sustainability measures, but also because of, again, I think an underestimated dependency of connectivity. I don't remember the name ship right now, but when it got stuck in the Suez Canal, and you saw the effect of one ship getting stuck in one canal, and basically people were asking, like, why can't we buy these products anymore? Why is there no production? Why is it slowing down? I mean, try to explain that. Yeah, you probably understand, but try to explain something like that to the average person, your friend, saying like, one ship, one canal, and the whole thing collapses. It does tell you that dependency on these value chains is on the one hand fantastic, but on the other hand also very dangerous if you don't have fallbacks. And you see this happening right now, again, because of the overall geopolitical situation. Now, then there's climate change, and I think the climate change challenge, I walked around here for about 10 minutes, and you see a lot of sustainability references. Your industries are trying to, become more sustainable because they want to, because they are obliged to. It's often a mix of things. But sustainability is everywhere. Climate change is on everybody's mind. And I think we're only at the beginning of trying to understand how we are going to deal with that. What you see right now on our side is that sustainability is definitely linked to trade. And I'm not talking about, a ship or a plane or a car or a truck, flying, driving around. I'm talking about, where can trade policy be either supportive to sustainability arrangements or sustainability initiatives, or vice versa, where do sustainability initiatives hamper trade? Now that discussion, I think, is already much ongoing, but will become much bigger in the future. Because you see around you, we referred to these measures just now already, a constant attempt by countries all around the world to take measures, to ensure that they remain in, obligations they signed on to in Paris. But what you then also see is that people who are affected by it, industry, traders, say like, well, wait a minute, that's very interesting, and I understand why you're doing it, but how come, company A is less affected than company B from another country? Well, how come that your local industry is maybe more supported or more protected than its international competitor? And that's where the WTO and its rules come in. Because what you can do and what you have to do, and what governments mostly do, you hold your sustainability measures, your policies, your initiatives against the rules that you signed on at WTO. That doesn't mean that we're going to be, a ruling on sustainability, or we're going to be allowed to express ourselves on policies at the national level, but there is the possibility to actually test. That's a long process. It's not an easy process. There are political influences. There are public pressures, because you can imagine, and we had these cases, that if there's a WTO ruling on a trade measure or a sustainability measure, which then says, well, that environmental policy that you implemented, is actually not valid under the WTO. And then you get reactions, people saying, well, why are you, World Trade Organization, even allowed to express yourself on environmental measures. We then say, because we're not against this at all, our rules allow this full stop, but you cannot discriminate. That's a simplification of the way a system works, but the bottom line is you can do these measures, but it has to be non-discriminatory across the board. And that's where the litmus test comes in. Every time these rules are being looked and these policies are being looked at WTO, and in quite a few cases they found that, somewhere indirectly, a measure with sometimes best intentions taken turned out to be discriminatory. And that violates WTO principles. So I remember way back when I started working at WTO, we got crucified by the environmental movement. This is 25 years ago. Because they say, you are ruling on something which protects the environment. We said, no, we're not ruling on that. We're ruling on the actual effects of the policy on individual competitors. And if there's discrimination, you can't do that. Now, the way this is developing, and I'm just, seeing what you see, reading what you read, is that countries mostly go individual and react to one another. And that's exactly opposite to the idea of multilateral cooperation, but also opposite to the idea of the World Trade Organization. Because if everybody starts doing whatever they think is best, then you will have multiple policies. You will have multiple regulations, and who pays the price for that? You do. Because you're going to have to face, every time you go to another country, there's another regulation, or there's another rule, or there's another demand, or there's another tariff, there's another tax. The idea is that it's not at all a bad idea to take measures in support of, climate sustainability, but do it in a transparent and a neutral discriminatory way. And that's what we say, and we want our members to come back to us. But what we unfortunately saw as a result of tensions, that members took measures and their members react. I mean, we had the tensions between the US and China, but also between the US and the EU about putting tariffs on certain products. They were not driven by sustainability in this particular case, but it's the same principle. And instead of then sitting down at WTO say hey, what are we actually doing here? What are we after? People start reacting, and that's what you see happening now in sustainability, and that's a concern that we see, that we express, because at the end it's only going to cost money, and does it really solve the problem? What's the point if somebody protects something at the border, but another one doesn't do it? I mean, pollution, like viruses, by the way, they don't know borders. They cross borders. They can't be stopped. Your products you can stop, but pollution you can't, and neither viruses. So you're going to have to deal with this, at the international level. Now, from our side, and I'll stop after, what we do, the most important first thing that we do for everybody, including you, is to provide as much transparency on our members' behavior. Put the information out there. What policies are there? What is being discussed? What does it mean? How does it link to the organization? We did this I said it already, during the financial crisis. We did it during the pandemic. During the pandemic, many countries started closing their borders, import, export, and going completely against anything they signed on to at WTO. Well, we can't tell them to not do it, because we're not the police. But we can expose. And it became, as in 2008 during the crisis, kind of a name and shame list. We just started producing these detailed list of detailed policy and measures. You need to be an expert to understand it. But what was done, what was happening, where it was done, whether it was already in Parliament or went through Parliament. So that's something which is very important in what we do, because it's important for you to know what your government is doing, because that's another thing. Governments also do a lot. I've worked for governments. I work for the European Commission. There's a lot of things happening that the average person, and it doesn't matter if you're an individual or a company, does not know about. So the transparency for us is very important. We also consistently say, whatever you do, and I said it a few times already, hold on to non-discrimination. Hold on to non-discrimination. You can do whatever you want, but non-discrimination is the key principle in the organization. I said too that, does it prevent countries from not living up or deviating? No, unfortunately not. We can't control, big and small powers, and we can't control how they react. We can just point out to them, you yourself negotiated this agreement, or this organization and these agreements, and now you're deviating from it. What's wrong? Well, it's a reflection of the current, I think, state of the world. It's more tense than it was 15 years ago, but it does happen, so they deviate. But there is recourse, again. If a government or a member of the WTO, I should say, has an issue with a measure in another member of the WTO, they can take it to the system, they can put it out there in committees. It sounds bureaucratic, to an extent it is, but that's how the process is. And eventually it can go to legal course or legal recourse if need may be. So that's two things that we offer. Now the same applies to sustainability. I mean, I don't have an answer, or a solution for every problem that you may face, but if sustainability measures are taken, and the CBAM, the CBAM, well, what is it, policy that the EU has designed and I think officially adopted today or yesterday, is being discussed at WTO. Different bodies, different committees. Why? They're looking at the effects, and they're looking at whether or not it's a balanced and non-discriminatory policy. And if it's not, they're going to get criticized. And who knows where this will end up. But what I mean is that when it links to trade, when there is a trade link, you can bring it to the organization. And even though trade and sustainability can go hand in hand, we have lots of initiatives where our members are looking at how can we use trade to support sustainability. I mean, right now the focus is mostly on the tensions, and our focus is mostly what can we do for you. So very concretely, and this is one step further, and this is actually not what I wrote up, what we do a lot, in case you as company representatives have an issue, and you want to know more about it, or you want to know what WTO's role can be, or you want to know more about WTO, we can offer you any kind of, training, explanation program. We get a lot of companies, smaller and bigger ones, that come to WTO. They bring some of their experts, and we set up a training, or let's say, training program, assistance program, whatever you want to call it. Doesn't really matter. But you meet experts, and they start understanding, okay, what is this agreement? What does WTO mean here? What can we do? What can we not do? Can we rely on the organization? Which is a very concrete thing that we try to do for the private sector in particular, and it's being used quite a lot. Yes, it takes an effort because you probably have to come here. We do travel from time to time, we do the same thing, but that's what we concretely try to do because, and maybe I shouldn't use this example and I'll stop after that. When the UK was leaving the European Union, we had a lot of companies in the UK start calling up WTO because they're saying like, oh, we now hear that we're going to be trading with the EU according to WTO rules and principles. What does that mean? Because of course they had never had that. They were mostly active within the EU, and now they suddenly heard this. We were not surprised, but we were surprised with the number of companies, people that came to us and wanted to know, because they had never heard about it. They had never been, confronted with it. And what we then did was just started explaining, this is what this means. This is where you can find exactly what tariff or what measure applies to your specific project, what is bound under the WTO, like what is legally binding, a tariff 5%, as I said before, and what that means for your trade. That's what you try to do, and that's where our role comes in mostly. Beyond that, I mean, if you have issues, you have to really talk to your government, because your governments can talk to other governments. That's the way to solve these problems. And I know sometimes that doesn't always work, or it takes too much time. We can try to help. Unfortunately, I say this on a personal basis, I mean, we don't have the right to express ourselves on some of these things, because sometimes, if it walks like a duck, quakes like a duck, probably a duck. Well, we can't say it if there's a violation. We have to let this go through the process and the procedures. I'll stop there, because I've taken, I think, about 15, 20 minutes. See if there's any questions or comments.
Thank you.
No, don't applaud.
Anyone would like to take this opportunity to ask a question to Bernard? I have one question. How do you deal with countries part of the WTO but not signing the Paris Agreement? Because not all of your members signed this agreement for the...
No, well, there you come at these fragmented, this fragmented international world. And in a way that's good, because let me reverse it. What if we would have influence on our members to sign an agreement which has, well, which has nothing to do with WTO? Mm-hmm. People will say, well, the Paris Agreement, like the International Labour Office, we sign agreements there because that's what we believe in. you as no role, as WTO have no role. So we can't really point to that. And that will, at the end, if it ever becomes like enforceable and binding, problematic. What if you have something you can enforce, and this happened actually in the past, a particular trade policy or an environmental or otherwise policy that was enforceable under WTO, but not under other organizations. So what you then have, that people came almost like, there was some, legal shopping happening. They're like, well, you have a binding legal system, why don't we get a ruling from WTO? We were sometimes forced, the system was forced to come up and express itself on something that didn't really have any experience with, because some members actually kicked off. But we could never tell another member of our WTO, you should sign an agreement here and there,
Okay.
outside of WTO.
Okay. And do you have a sustainability working group or think tank inside WTO to integrate these environmental issues and?
We have, when the organization was established in '95, talk about visionary, they actually created a committee on trade and environment, where at that point in time, nobody was talking about it, nobody. But they thought it was important, and they created that committee. You can imagine it's a busier committee now than it was 25 years ago. We have a lot of initiatives taken by our members right now on how to deal with sustainability in the area of binding legal trade agreements. We have an initiative on plastics pollution, for example. I specifically look at, like, what does plastic pollution mean? Is there a trade link? Is plastic, waste being traded? Yes, it is. Should you look at that? Should you have rules at WTO dealing with that? We have a group of our members talking about circular economy. I mean, our trade rules don't talk about that because they were not designed at the time that the word circular economy even existed. I can give you many more examples of our rules that do not reflect current economy. But that's, for example. So there's a lot of work done on it because people want to be ahead. They don't want to find out, in 5 years from now, we should have taken measures or negotiated a deal because this is now relevant. So in that sense, they're looking forward, which is good. Doesn't happen too often in international organizations.
Always with the same decision process and the need to have unanimity between your member, which is probably a limitation in your.
Now we're getting into nerdy, kind of intergovernmental organization details. But to say it very simple, anything officially mandated under the WTO is an agreement between all ministers of all members. And that then falls under our rules and procedure. It has to go through committees. It has to follow, certain processes. Most of the talks that are going on about anything related to sustainability or, for example, electronic commerce is done by a group of members without a formally binding mandate. And that's again, it sounds very legalistic. It isn't actually, but it means they're not bound by any rule or procedures. And they do this on purpose because they know not all 164 members of the WTO want to talk about plastic pollutions or about electronic commerce. So they decided, well, we can't wait because, the economy is moving forward, the world is moving backward from an environmental perspective. Why don't we start? And this is 80, 90, 100 plus countries do that. Small, big, developing, developed. Countries that realize this is important. But there are countries that are not part of it. But the advantage is that they can do whatever they want. In terms of procedures, they can just talk and come up with ideas, negotiate, which is, in my view, the future of the organization. Some of our members wouldn't like it if I say that, but I'm saying it anyway.
Thank you. No question from the floor? Oh, I see nobody. There is one. Wait a second, the microphone is coming.
What size is the organization that's in place to help businesses?
We are a small organization. We're only based here in Geneva, Switzerland. We don't have offices around the world like most other international organizations. We're about 650, 700, if you take temporary contracts, people, which is not big for an international organization. So one of the constant challenges we face, if you want to be on the ground talking to people who actually are trading or are confronted with trade and trade policies, it's a challenge. That's why I'm saying, and I really mean it, that's why it doesn't happen too often that you get multiple people from industries together and you can talk to them, because we're not abroad, we're not on the ground. So we're a small organization from an international perspective.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks.